In the year 1804, only a few months before he had proclaimed himself Emperor of France, 35-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte stood before the State Council to discuss war with Great Britain. Although he was not yet officially emperor, Napoleon had already become the single most powerful person in the country. After leading a successful coup d'etat against the government in 1799, he demonstrated his political skills by first rigging the approval of the new French constitution, and then going on to fix his own election to become First Consul of France. The consul was the highest level of France's government, and by establishing himself as First Consul, Napoleon became the unofficial head of the French Republic. The first thing he did was oversee the swift centralization of political power, with himself at the center. These changes transformed France into, ironically, an authoritarian republican government, with Napoleon being the unofficial autocrat in charge. It is important to understand that just because Napoleon had centralized political power and ushered in a new form of authoritarianism, that France as a whole was not less free, quite the contrary. Under Napoleon's new leadership, the French economy grew exceptionally fast, and this was due to new economic and legal reforms which gave a significant amount of economic liberty to French citizens. Although this may seem like somewhat of a contradiction, it is perfectly understandable. Napoleon was in favor of economic freedom, though he was convinced that political liberty must be repressed. This is quite understandable, since as a young man Napoleon experienced the disasters of the Bourbon government's intervention in the economy, as well as the breakdown of the rule of law and the resulting political instability of the French Revolution. His new economic policies included the introduction of sound money, lower taxes, the abolition of unions and guilds, the creation of an independent and robust peasantry, the establishment of the French National Bank, and the creation of new and far more effective systems of tax collection. These decisions proved remarkably successful, and this is mostly because they involved less government interference in people's economic choices. As for Napoleon's legal reforms, he ushered in several important institutions, most notably the French Civil Code under a newly unified court system, which brought a strong rule of law to France, further aiding its economic development. Greater religious toleration was also introduced, as was trial by jury. For the average person, Napoleon's consolidation and exercise of power was hugely favorable for their standard of living and overall quality of life. When he had first come to power in 1799, Napoleon had threatened to invade Britain. Although this was just empty talk, Napoleon continued his anti-British rhetoric, hoping to provoke Britain into a war with France. His reason for this was simple. He wanted to diminish Britain's influence on the European continent so that France could prevail as the continental superpower. In 1803, the British finally took the bait and declared war on France as a way to preemptively safeguard their own political security. By obtaining a first mover's advantage from declaring war on France, the British viewed themselves to be in a more defensive position. Of course, Napoleon understood geopolitics extremely well. He was the one, after all, who had tempted the British into war in the first place. He knew that even though he was the almighty First Consul, he couldn't get anything done if the people didn't support him. After living through the horrors of the French Revolution in 1789, Napoleon understood that it was not the bureaucrats and politicians who really mattered, but that it was the peasantry which held the power to make or break the government. He made it his goal to win them over. This was made clear when, standing in front of the State Council in 1804, Napoleon made his case for war. He told the other members quite bluntly that, quote, "We are here to guide public opinion, not to discuss it," end quote. Rather than doing what public opinion wanted, Napoleon took the view that it was better to simply influence public opinion so that it conformed with the interests of the government. This is another way of saying that Napoleon had very little respect for the intelligence of the common people, and that he viewed them more or less as sheep waiting to be led. He also believed that influencing public opinion was quite straightforward, so long as the proper measures were taken. Napoleon was a master of censorship and propaganda. Throughout his career, he was extremely careful about his communications and meticulously oversaw every detail of what his government was doing with regard to public media and propaganda. He even commissioned musicians, theater productions, and painters to portray him as larger than life. That is, powerful, heroic, always victorious, and unstoppable. This is not all. He also tightly controlled the press, dictating what was and was not allowed to be published. Anything negative about the government was strictly forbidden. In fact, the number of newspapers in France actually fell from several dozen in 1799, when he became First Consul, to just 4 by 1814. Moreover, Napoleon routinely made up whatever facts he liked, in particular those that related to his military campaigns. For instance, he regularly issued military bulletins which grossly exaggerated the number of enemies his armies had killed and captured, and downplayed France's own losses. It is actually these dispatches which the phrase "lie like a bulletin" entered the French lexicon. His propaganda was so widely circulated throughout Europe, and so skillfully crafted and so often repeated, that virtually everything he said came to be perceived as true by the common people. Of course, some free-thinking individuals saw his propaganda for what it was, but daring to speak up was simply not worth the risk. People just didn't want to be told that they were wrong and that they were living a lie. Believing everything their government told them and unflinchingly supporting their leader had become part of their personality. To face the truth would have been for many people to destroy their identity, and so people blindly supported a leader who lied to them, manipulated them, and led them into total military and economic collapse.